Welcome to Things That Are Harder. Today we're going to talk about quadrupeds, getting that doggo in your game. The first thing we're going to talk about is animation. When you look at a quadruped, a dog or a horse or a cat animating, you can notice that the entire body is involved in the movement. Now this is true with humans as well when they're standing up, but it's not as true. And this actually lets you do something with humanoids or bipeds that is much more difficult to do with a quadruped, which is to layer animations on top of each other, to isolate the upper body to allow them to hold a sword or swing a gun around or pick up a flower without having to override the entire body. And this allows you to combine different animations to give you a wider collection of activities you can do. With a quadruped, it's not really possible to do this because their entire body is getting into the movement. Now that being said, if you had something that was quadrupedal but then had arms on top, a centaur or something to that effect, you'd probably be able to replicate this effect. But for standard animals, you are animating the entire body for every activity that they do. Now, something that might seem like a thing that is harder for quadrupeds is motion capture. It's easy to get a human into a booth and have them do whatever and capture that with your motion capture suit. And the reality is, yeah, this is easier to do with a human, but it's not impossible to do with animals. There is motion capture data available for horses, for dogs. I believe even for a tarantula has been motion captured at this point. Those animations do exist for basic things, moving around and the like. That being said, you don't have animations for more esoteric things. You can get a human to do anything you want, anything the human body is capable of doing, you can motion capture. You are going to be limited in what you are able to get a horse to do for motion capture because you don't want to injure the horse and it doesn't understand fully what you're asking it to do. But there are actually options there as well. There are some stunt actors and motion capture actors who are capable of emulating the motion of different animals. It's not perfect, but it does give you a baseline. Humans are really good at telling when things are off with other humans. The uncanny valley is something I may talk about at a future point, but the short form is simply that the closer something is to human, the easier it is for people to tell when something's off. So one advantage you get with creatures or quadrupeds, even things like dogs, is a certain ability to be a little bit more off than you can be with people. But the primary reason that quadrupeds are hard has less to do with their animation, with their motion, and more to do with their basic shape. What do I mean by this? Well, a quadruped is long. A biped is basically upright. So right on the surface, right at the first thing, think about how this means you interact with stairs. A person walking up and down stairs pretty much stays standing up, while a quadruped, they have to turn into the angle of the stairs that they're going up or going down. But there's even more. To explain the next part, I'm going to have to dig in a little bit on the way that collision works in most video games. Most of the time, when you're colliding two different things in a video game, you're not actually colliding the mesh of the thing you see. You're colliding a simplification, a capsule. So what's a capsule? Well, let's start here. The easiest thing to figure out if you're colliding with is a sphere. Because what's a sphere? A sphere is simply a single point that you can then measure your distance from. And if you are less than the radius of the sphere, you have collided with the sphere. A capsule is basically just a sphere that you've slid along a line. So it looks like a cylinder that has hemispheres on either end. But this is also a relatively easy shape to figure out if you've collided with, because you just measure your distance from that line segment, and if it's less than the radius of your capsule, then you've collided. So you don't typically use boxes to collide or arbitrary shapes. You usually use a single large capsule around the creature. Possibly for some things you might use multiple capsules, but but for the sake of this video, we're just going to assume that you're using a single capsule. So for a biped, you can use a single upright capsule, and most of the animations that they do, that capsule doesn't need to turn. It can pretty much just stay upright. There are extreme cases where there is going to be a greater distortion, but you can pretty much get away with that capsule being upright. On the other hand, for a quadruped, you're probably going to have to tip that capsule on its side, and that presents a bunch of problems for physics and interactions and pathfinding. But to explain these things, we're going to have to change venues, and we're going to have to bring out some props.
Okay, here we have a pretty typical arrangement, a big open room with a hallway going off of it. If you have a little wooden guy, he's a capsule, he's got a round base. Pretty much if he can fit through an opening, he can turn any direction within that opening, everything works out fine, no problem at all. On the other hand, something that is a quadruped that is long, like this lion, it has a long and skinny base. It can fit into the opening, but then you have a problem because it actually can't turn within that opening. It's getting jammed inside that opening. So you have an issue because you can get your creatures into positions where they can get into something, but they may not be able to turn around to get out. Now, you might be thinking, well, there's an easy solution to this. If you make the capsule for the lion as wide as it is long, then it won't go into that hallway because it won't be able to fit. It does solve the hallway issue, but it introduces a different problem. So here we have our lion in a big open space. So regardless of the shape of his capsule, he can turn around, he can maneuver. If we make his width the same as his length to avoid that hallway problem, we get something that looks basically like about that. Not quite, but you know, he's a big square, a big capsule. But that introduces a different problem because there's his space. If he is in combat and you're using that same collision avoidance, then you get into a situation where you have creatures on the side that are very, very far away from him. The ones from behind and in front are right up against him, but the ones from the side are really far away. Their animations are not going to reach him. They'll be swinging at nothing. The next obvious thing to do is to only use that enlarged capsule for the purposes of pathfinding so that they don't go through hallways. But that introduces a different problem because now if we're back like this, yeah, the creatures can get right up to him and interact with him in a way that their animations are actually intersecting with the body. But now you've boxed him in again. He actually can't move because there's not enough room for him to turn. And if his animation doesn't include things that reach to the sides, he's trapped once more. Whereas with little wooden guy, even if he is completely surrounded, because he is essentially a capsule, he can turn, and he can turn in any direction. There's no interference whatsoever.
Okay, that's enough props. So what do you do about this? This is a problem that actually requires several different solutions. So one thing that you can do is to make their capsule halfway between their length and their width. For creatures that are not too long, like dogs and cats and a lot of other creatures are not too bad, you get something that kind of works. You'll get a little bit of clipping with their front and back, and creatures will be a little bit too far on the sides, but you might get away with it. For really long creatures like horses, this is probably not going to cut it because they'll be sticking their heads inside of walls. One thing you can do for creatures that are going to get into combat is have them adopt a sitting pose when they're in combat. A cat sitting back on its haunches basically is a cylinder. You have a transition issue now because when they're moving, they're an elongated capsule, but when they're in combat sitting down, they are a vertical capsule, and you don't necessarily have a way to move between those two states. But if you give your creature some sort of clearing attack, then they can push everything away from them in combat to give themselves enough room to switch to that other capsule shape. Alternatively, for monsters, you could make it so that their stationary shape is big and wide and takes as much room as the longer shape they have when they're moving. Actually, if you look at something like an elephant, they're fairly broad. So you're getting to the place where you might be able to get away with something that is just a big cylinder around them. So why are quadrupeds hard? They're hard because they're a different animation problem, but mainly they're hard because they're long. And that means that they have special issues in movement, in positioning, and in maneuvering around your game. Hopefully this was insightful. If it was, please share it with someone else. Give this video a like. I will see you again soon. Thank you.